The Fugates of Kentucky. Martin Fugate arrived in eastern Kentucky around 1820 as a French orphan, with almost nothing to his name, settling near a remote stretch of water called Troublesome Creek in the Appalachian Mountains. He married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith, and by all accounts it seemed like an ordinary frontier marriage, except for one invisible detail that neither of them could have known. Both Martin and Elizabeth carried a rare recessive gene variant responsible for a condition called methemoglobinemia, a disorder in which hemoglobin molecules lose their ability to carry oxygen efficiently, causing the blood to run dark and the skin to take on a visibly blue or purple-gray tone. Carrying one copy of the gene produces no outward effect whatsoever. Carrying two copies turns you the color of a fresh bruise from the moment you're born. For that to happen to a child, both parents need to be carriers, a statistical rarity under normal circumstances. But Troublesome Creek was not normal circumstances. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in the early 19th century were some of the most geographically isolated terrain in North America, with no roads, no bridges, and no real reason for outsiders to come in or for locals to leave. The Fugates married their neighbors, and their neighbors were their cousins, and their cousins were their neighbors' cousins. And over the following century, the same small pool of bloodlines circulated through the same small set of hollows and creek beds in an endless loop. The recessive gene, instead of being diluted and eventually disappearing as it would in a larger outbreeding population, got concentrated. Blue children started appearing in almost every generation. Some families had multiple blue children. The community largely accepted this as simply a Fugate family trait. Strange, certainly, but not life-threatening, since methemoglobinemia in this form, while visually dramatic, didn't typically cause severe health consequences beyond fatigue and occasional shortness of breath. The family lived, worked, farmed, and died in those mountains for generation after generation, and the blue skin became as unremarkable to the neighbors as the color of the creek itself. It wasn't until the 1960s that a hematologist named Dr. Madison Cowing, working out of the University of Kentucky, heard rumors of blue-skinned people living in the hills and drove out to find them. He did. He drew blood, confirmed the methemoglobinemia diagnosis, and treated several family members with intravenous injections of methylene blue, a compound that temporarily restores hemoglobin's oxygen-carrying function, and watched their skin turn pink within minutes for the first time in their lives. The most famous modern case is Benjamin Stacy, born in 1975, who came into the world so visibly blue that the hospital staff panicked before his grandmother calmly explained the family history. Benji's blue color faded as he grew older, which is typical when a person carries only one copy of the gene rather than two. Today, the Fugate case is a standard teaching example in genetics courses worldwide, used to demonstrate exactly how a rare recessive trait survives and spreads in a population that never stops marrying itself. The Whitakers of West Virginia. The Whitakers live in Odd, West Virginia. And yes, that is a real place name, and yes, it fits perfectly. Filmmaker Mark Laita first visited the property in 2004 while working on a photography project documenting extreme poverty in rural America, and was immediately chased off by a family member with a shotgun. He came back years later, built a cautious rapport through repeated visits and small acts of assistance, and in 2020 released footage of the family that spread across the internet with the speed of something people genuinely couldn't believe was real. The video accumulated tens of millions of views in a matter of weeks. The Whitakers are not a historical case. They are alive right now, on that property in Odd, West Virginia, and they represent what the accumulated biological consequences of multi-generational close relative reproduction look like when you remove every external corrective force. Education, healthcare, legal oversight, economic mobility, and simply let a family fold in on itself for decades. Several family members are entirely nonverbal. Others communicate in ways that are very difficult to understand. Multiple individuals display physical features and behavioral patterns consistent with what geneticists call inbreeding depression, the process by which repeated reproduction between closely related individuals causes harmful recessive gene variants to stack up across generations until they begin expressing themselves as visible physical and cognitive impairments. The precise degree of familial relationship between the various Whitaker family members has never been publicly confirmed through genetic testing, but the visible evidence and local community accounts strongly suggest multiple consecutive generations of close relative reproduction within a bloodline that never substantially introduced outside genetic material. West Virginia has historically had some of the highest rates of rural poverty, geographic isolation, and limited state social service reach in the entire United States. And the combination of those factors with a family already living on the margins created conditions where this degree of generational inbreeding could persist for decades without triggering any formal intervention. Laita has continued visiting. In a 2023 follow-up video, he documented modest improvements in the family's living conditions. New flooring, a cleaner home, funded in part by donations that came in after the original video went viral. He has consistently presented the family with more dignity than most observers expected, resisting the obvious temptation to frame them as spectacle. But the underlying genetic reality documented in those videos doesn't change with a coat of paint. The Whitakers are the most visible contemporary example in the United States of what happens at the biological endpoint of extreme generational inbreeding. Not in a history book, not in a medieval dynasty, but in a house you could drive to right now. The Lykov family. In 1936, a Soviet officer shot and killed a man named Lykov in front of his brother Karp. Karp Lykov was a devout old believer, a member of a Russian Orthodox sect that had been persecuted by both the Tsarist and Soviet governments for centuries. And in the aftermath of his brother's murder, with Stalinist anti-religious purges intensifying across the Soviet Union, he made a decision that would define the rest of his family's existence. He took his wife Akalina, their son Savin, and their daughter Natalia, and walked into the Siberian taiga. They kept walking until there was nothing around them but forest. They settled eventually in the Abakan range of the western Sayan Mountains, at an elevation of over 1,000 meters. More than 250 kilometers from the nearest human settlement. In isolation, Akalina gave birth to 2 more children, Dmitry and Agafia, who were born knowing nothing of the outside world, no other humans, no other voices, no other reference point for reality beyond their immediate family of 6, and the wilderness pressing in on every side. The family survived for 42 years this way, growing rye and potatoes in a small clearing, hunting with handmade tools, and praying according to old believer traditions using handwritten religious texts they had carried into the forest. They lost Akulina to starvation in 1961, during a particularly brutal winter when the crops failed. The children grew up, but there was nowhere for them to go, and no one outside the family for them to form relationships with. The genetic implications of that reality require no elaboration. Then in 1978, a team of Soviet geologists conducting an aerial survey spotted the clearing and landed. The Lykovs' first contact with another human being in over 4 decades was a group of scientists who materialized from the taiga carrying equipment the family had never seen. 3 of the 4 Lykov children died in 1981, within months of each other, shortly after that contact began. The most widely accepted explanation is immune naivety. Decades of total isolation had left them with no acquired immunity to pathogens that are entirely routine for anyone with normal social exposure, and the geologists, without knowing it, had simply breathed in their direction. Agafia Lykov, the youngest, survived. As of the early 2020s, she is still alive, still living alone in the taiga, near the original family settlement, now in her late 70s, having outlasted every other member of her family, and continued refusing permanent settlement despite the Soviet government's, and later the Russian government's, periodic offers. She receives occasional visitors and supply drops. She remains, in practical terms, the last living member of a family that compressed an entire gene pool down to the size of a single household and then sealed it shut for half a century. The Habsburgs and their surviving descendants. The Habsburg dynasty ruled over the better part of Europe for roughly 3 centuries, and they did it partly through war and partly through marriage, specifically, marriage to each other. The logic was straightforward from a political standpoint. If you marry your daughter to a foreign king, you create an alliance. If you marry your daughter to your nephew, you keep the territory, the titles, and the inheritance all within the family. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married repeatedly across generations. The same family names cycled through the dynasty's genealogical records in loops that would be illegal under the laws of virtually every modern country. For a while, it worked. The Habsburgs accumulated control over Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast colonial territories across the Americas. But the genetic bill was accumulating the entire time, and it eventually came due in the form of Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, the last Habsburg king of the Spanish branch, and quite possibly the most medically documented victim of deliberate dynastic inbreeding in recorded history. A 2019 study published in the journal Heredity reconstructed the Habsburg pedigree across 16 generations and more than 6,000 individuals to calculate Charles II inbreeding coefficient, the statistical measure of how likely he was to have inherited identical gene copies from a common ancestor, and arrived at a figure of 0.254. For context, the inbreeding coefficient that would result from a child born to two full siblings is 0.5. Charles II exceeded that. His jaw protruded so severely, the characteristic Habsburg mandibular prognathism that appears in painted portraits getting more extreme with each successive generation, that he reportedly could not chew solid food. He didn't speak until he was 4 years old. He never walked steadily. He suffered what court physicians described as recurring convulsions, and was mentally impaired in ways that made governing largely a ceremonial exercise. He was married twice and produced no surviving children, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely and triggering the War of the Spanish Succession. The broader dynasty's infant mortality rate during the height of its inbreeding practices exceeded 50%, more than double the roughly 20% rate in the general Spanish population of the same era, itself already devastated by the standards of modern medicine. Epilepsy, immune dysfunction, and what historical records describe as melancholy and madness, appeared with disproportionate frequency across the family tree. The Austrian branch lasted longer and was somewhat more genetically cautious in its later centuries, which is why its descendants exist today. The House of Habsburg-Lorraine includes living members, among them Karl von Habsburg, born in 1961, and his children, modern individuals who marry outside the family and live unremarkable contemporary lives, but who carry in their DNA the genetic legacy of 500 years of a family that treated marriage as a territorial strategy and paid for it in bone deformity, infant mortality, and the slow extinction of an entire royal line. The Colt family. In 2012, in a dry paddock near the town of Burrawa in rural New South Wales, Australian welfare authorities encountered a scene that initially defied their ability to process it. 12 people were found living in conditions of extreme squalor on a remote property. The children had no birth certificates, had never attended school, and communicated in what investigators initially couldn't identify as any recognizable language. It was later determined to be a severely degraded form of English combined with invented vocabulary, a dialect that had evolved in complete isolation from any outside linguistic input. Medical examinations of the children found fused vertebrae, intellectual disabilities, severe developmental delays, and physical deformities consistent with multi-generational inbreeding. One adult male family member was assessed with an IQ below 40. The family, referred to in all Australian court proceedings and media coverage by the pseudonym the Colts, to protect the identities of the children involved, had a family structure in which the children of the founding couple, referred to in court records as Charlie and Betty Colt, had reproduced with each other, producing a third generation of children born from sibling relationships. In some instances, the degree of biological relationship between the parents of specific children could not be definitively established because the family's own accounts were contradictory and unreliable, and there were no external records of any kind to cross-reference. Criminal proceedings stretched across several years of New South Wales court hearings, resulting in multiple convictions for incest and child sexual abuse. The case prompted a significant review of child protection policies in rural New South Wales, particularly regarding the state's capacity to identify and intervene with families living entirely off-grid and outside any institutional contact. The children removed from the property faced a challenge that is almost impossible to fully articulate. They were being asked to integrate into a society for which they had no framework whatsoever. They had never used a telephone. They had never watched television. They had never interacted with a human being outside their own family unit. Several older children functioned cognitively at the level of toddlers. The Colt case is not from a distant century or a geographically inaccessible corner of the developing world. It unfolded in Australia in the 2010s, in a country with compulsory education laws, a universal healthcare system, and a functioning child protection bureaucracy, which makes it perhaps the most disturbing demonstration on this entire list of how thoroughly a family can disappear from every social system designed to catch exactly this kind of situation, and what the biological consequences look like when it does. The Sentinelese of North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island sits in the Bay of Bengal, part of the Andaman Islands chain administered by India, and from the air it looks like a green jewel ringed by turquoise water and coral reef. Roughly 72 square kilometers of dense jungle with no visible roads, no clearings, no structures that can be identified from above, and no sign of the people who live there except, occasionally, the figures of those people on the beach, drawing bows at the aircraft overhead. The Sentinelese have lived on that island for an estimated 50 to 60,000 years. They have resisted every attempt at contact, sometimes with arrows, sometimes with spears, always with unmistakable clarity, and as a result they remain one of the last genuinely uncontacted peoples on Earth, which means that almost everything known about their genetic situation is inferred rather than directly measured. What can be inferred is significant. A founding population that has been sealed from all outside genetic contact for 60 millennia, living on an island of 72 square kilometers with an estimated current population somewhere between 50 and 500 individuals. The range is that wide because no one has ever been able to count them safely, represents a genetic bottleneck of extraordinary depth. Every person on that island is descended from the same small group of ancestors. Every person on that island is, by definition, the relative of every other person on that island. The effective breeding population across their entire history has likely never exceeded a few hundred individuals at most, which means the Sentinelese gene pool contains a fraction of the diversity present in populations that have been mixing with outside groups throughout their existence. The biological consequences of that kind of long-term isolation in comparably sized founder populations typically include dramatically reduced overall genetic diversity, a higher prevalence of fixed recessive traits, and, most dangerously, severely compromised immune response to novel pathogens. That last point is exactly why the Indian government maintains a legal exclusion zone prohibiting approach within 3 nautical miles of the island. Contact with the outside world could expose the Sentinelese to diseases to which they have no immunity whatsoever, potentially with catastrophic results. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow paid local fishermen to bring him to the island in defiance of Indian law, with the stated intention of converting the Sentinelese to Christianity. He was killed by arrows on the beach. His death briefly refocused global attention on the island and prompted a debate that has never been fully resolved. Whether the Indian government's policy of protective isolation is itself a form of harm, denying a living population access to medicine, education, and genetic diversity in the name of cultural preservation, or whether forced contact would simply destroy them faster. The Sentinelese are the only entry on this list where the word inbreeding feels genuinely inadequate. This is not a family that made destructive choices, not a dynasty that prioritized power over biology, not a community trapped by geography and poverty. This is an entire people living inside the longest-running genetic bottleneck in human history, and the arrows on the beach are the only data they have ever chosen to share with the outside world. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.